Archaeodeath, walking in the footsteps of past funerals. Welcome, folks, to another chat between Irina and myself about things to do with the Vikings, death and burial. It's archaeology professor Howard Williams here with...
I'm Irina. Hello, you already know me.
And we are going to basically continue our conversation from last time, where we were talking about the complex and varied ways in which material cultures were placed with the dead, reflecting not perhaps only the identities of those who had passed on, but also the various performances and identities of those participating in the funerary ritual. But today we're going to try and shift things to more of a textual approach, but also to do with monumentality. And in many ways, there's a whole conversation here about how mounds and other kinds of funerary monuments are, again, understood. How do archaeologists, how do academics understand these mounds, these monuments and other structures, and how they've been understood in later centuries as people write about them, and how actually they have a place in popular culture, such as the TV show Vikings. Various video games are all about entering into mounds and dealing with the dead. And so we have many different layers, as usual, of information and misinformation to tackle. But where should we start, Irina?
Well, I think we should start with the Kings Sagas. Mounds are very interesting to study from the perspective of memorial culture. So if you refer to literature, they are linked to, let's say, physical and symbolic boundaries, and they're also related to status, to high status. They're related to rulership, but also to, let's call it, ritualized memory or memory rituals that might have taken place here. And we have a lot of interesting examples from the sagas of the kings. So from Heimskringla, which is the history of the kings of Norway and of Sweden, because they were kind of like tied up together, written by Snorri Sturluson. And here, Snorri Sturluson, at least in his first saga, the Ynglinga saga, about the mythical kings of Scandinavia, he mentions some interesting things that he thought was going on in pre-Christian times, and among those things also some memorials in the shape of mounds and also halls. So if you read the Ynglinga saga, this is a work where he tries to euhemerize the gods. So you're going to find Norse gods here. You're going to find Odin, Njord, and Freyr. Mainly, these are the three gods he mentions. And you're going to find them euhemerized, so they become humans, and they are the first rulers of Scandinavia. Now, Snorri is not really known for being very structured when he discussed mythical things, because the same gods are not euhemerized any longer if you read the Prose Edda, where they're just gods. But then it's very interesting what he says about mounds and funerary habits, because this is our topic for today. So he mentions the age of burning, and he also mentions the age of mounds, and he says that there was this time, since time immemorial, people used to be burned and memorial stones raised for them. But then he mentions something very interesting, which is kind of like a myth about how mounds came into being. He mentions that the god Freyr was interred in a mound at Uppsalir in Uppsala, which was a very important, let's say, central place. I think that's the correct term to use nowadays. Yeah. And he also says here that people continued to build monuments for their important ones, but then they used, so for the kings and for the jarls, these mounds were starting to be built. And it's very interesting the way he links it to this whole idea of prosperity. Because he mentions an interesting story about Freyr. So Freyr, at some point, he dies, and he's carried in secret into a tomb, into a burial mound. And the people, so the Sviar, they are told that he is still alive and he's kept there for 3 years. And in this time, people go to the mound, so they actually interact with this mound and they pour the tribute into the mound. So there are 3 windows and they pour copper, silver, and gold coins through these windows. And it is said that the time of prosperity continued because people were doing that. So you can see here a link, at least in the work of Snorri, a link between monumentality, mythical beings such as Freyr, and also this whole idea of prosperity, so prosperity and peace. And this is something you're going to notice in other stories as well. It's very interesting to see the case of King Adils, who also has a mound attributed to him also here in Uppsala. It is said that he attended a sacrifice for the so-called Disir, who are more or less mysterious beings in the world of Old Norse mythology. There seems to have been a connection between Disir and other female deities such as Valkyriur. We always try to find these clear-cut distinctions between them, but I don't think it was it was like that in the minds of those people. These categories most likely overlapped. At any rate, we do get the impression from the sources that the Disir were rather linked to families. They were very linked to households and to particular places, to landscapes. So he tells us something very interesting about the Disir, that this King Adils rode a horse to the halls of the Dis, and then something bad happened. The king was involved in an accident, and then he died, and then a burial mound was also erected here for him. And the Sviar considered him a great king, and so on. It's very interesting that people preserve this memory also in the Romantic period. For example, these mounds were considered to be either the mounds of the gods, so the mounds of Odin, Njord, and Freyr, or the mounds of these kings. I also find it interesting in what Snorri presents us that he tends to associate Odin with the whole habit of cremation. He tells us in chapter 8 that Odin is the one who established the laws in the country. So largely speaking in Scandinavia, and he ordained that all people should be burnt. But at the same time, he does mention Freyr and the fact that Freyr is rather linked to this whole idea of erecting mounds and burying people in here. Again, a potential reference to a myth regarding, or to the memory of a myth regarding prosperity and fertility. So I will come back to Uppsala a bit later because the recent archaeological reports from here are also interesting. Just wanted to show you a little bit about Halfdan the Black, who is again a very interesting character here. It's the second saga you can read in Snorri's works, in Heimskringla, and the end of Halfdan is presented as something very interesting, especially with regards to what people do with his body, speaking of this whole myth of prosperity and fertility. So it is said that Harald Svati was driving from a banquet. At some point, he and his jarls were driving across some sort of watering hole that was filled up with dung, but then the ice had molten onto it and then frozen again. So essentially they drove over it and it collapses. So they die. A mound is erected for him, and it is told repeatedly that Halfdan was blessed with the most prosperous seasons, which is why people were not really pleased when they heard he was going to be buried only in one single mound. There were a lot of people coming from different regions of Norway, speaking of which Halfdan the Black most likely had this region here with the red, marked in red. And these jarls asked if they couldn't do something with his body so that everyone could enjoy the prosperity that was associated with this particular king. So they decided to divide the body of the king in several parts, in 4 parts to be more precise, and a head was laid in a mound at Stein in Hringa Riki. And it is told that that would ensure the prosperity of these kingdoms in the future as well. It would seem that such a myth, which is a little bit weird, I mean, we find it only in Englinga Saga. It might be, I think, a reflection of a foundational myth, because it's the same thing we find in the Poetic Edda with regard to how the universe was created in the world of Norse mythology. So I think there would be a connection here, because it is told that Odin and his brothers divided the corpse of the giant Ymir in several parts, and thus they created the cosmos. So maybe that would be something that inspired Snorri in this story, perhaps.
So can I just ask at this point? So you've got this attempt to root the gods in the landscape that Snorri has. I mean, Snorri is in Iceland. He doesn't have a close understanding of the geography of Uppsala or anything like that. So these are conceptually distant and in time and space, and he's trying to connect them into the landscape. But that does reveal something that would have been shared across the Viking world and the later medieval world is this idea of the mound contains a story. The mound contains is a prompt to memory. Is that even though it's to do with legends, there's something deeply social there. Is that fair to say? And about memory.
I think so. Yeah, definitely. So I think we should think about these mounds as representative of not only of power and rulership, but also about the stuff that was going on around them, perhaps in relation to a cultic center, for example. I mean, we do know that Uppsala was a large cultic center and a seat, a royal seat. So it was, on the other hand, this memory of dynastic authority and control at some point in different regions of Scandinavia that Snorri might have picked up from different sources until the time he wrote. And then there would have also been this memory which he links to this mythical Ynglingar dynasty, this memory about the divine origins of kings, or more generally speaking, about the divine origins of the ancestors. I mean, in the stories he tells about, at least about these kings or gods, there is a tendency to present them in a way that would connect them to the distant past. So he tries to interact with this distant past and tries to make it a little bit more accessible, and as something contemporaries might resort to every once in a while, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's almost like it's our understanding how mounds operate in these textual sources, not by thinking them as literal accounts of what may have actually happened, but about how they work in the cultural context. Is that? So I'm just trying to make sure that I understand we're on the same sort of, playing field or same position, or do you think that's not an appropriate way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think they were largely part of the memorial culture, and some way. I think it is also safe to say, or at least it's educated guess, that memorial rituals would have taken place at the burial grounds during the Viking Age. But by the time Snorri is writing, the memories would have become also a little vague, and they would have mixed with all these myths about prosperous kings, or kings with a great deal of luck. Luck is also a great theme, topic in these sources. So mounds, on the one hand, as an arena for expressing power and rulership, and on the other hand, as a site for memory production.
Do you think that? I have another question, if I may. I wonder whether the archaeological record reveals that mounds are only part of a broader set of funerary architectures. We have stone settings of different shapes, as we discussed last time with Lindholm Hoyer, and we have we have various other forms of flat grave that may have had posts and stakes, and we know that from the Viking Age this was but one option of marking graves, and mounds are incredibly varied in scale and character. And do you think that it actually shows there is some distance of time, that mounds are the primary thing referenced in the saga literature, that the earthen form or the stone cairn form is what is surviving without anything else? Because if they were writing with an intimate knowledge of how people in the Viking Age were constructing funerary architectures, they would be mentioning surely a wider range of other options and structures. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Burial mounds. I think they remain like this main source for mythical thinking because of their position, because of their geography, landscape, and so on. I think they were still, at least in some way, very visible and very relatable to the medieval people. And there is also the thing about who these people were who were writing and why they were writing. So they didn't really bother with something that wasn't considered high status. So we're talking about the sagas of the kings. So the kings are in these sagas generally associated with mounds, with monumentality, and this is in fact something that I think it's also visible in geography, because in Uppsalir, like the largest mounds were built in the 6th, 7th century, but then they were reused in the Viking Age. So people were trying, starting with the Viking Age, to connect to these older monuments. Okay, in the case of Uppsalir, we're talking about the Iron Age, but there are other sites where they were trying to make a connection with monuments from the Bronze Age, for example, such as Lyra. Yeah, so
already in the Viking. Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
So already in the Viking Age, we have that deep time connection to older sites, and they wouldn't have had our archaeological chronology, so they wouldn't have known they were Bronze Age. But we have lots of archaeological evidence showing that Viking Age people were deeply interested in old mounds or old traces that may have been the sites of houses or cult sites, but they saw them as significant to connect to for a whole host of reasons. And so the textual tradition is sort of picking up, and already many stages of interaction with the past. The Viking Age is producing new mounds that augment old mounds or contribute to those place-making memory cultures.
Yeah, exactly. They also had a more practical meaning. I mean, we know this from later legal texts that they were very useful in marking ownership. Like the rich farmers would use mounds to not only to express their social standing, but also to better define the territories they possess. So I think that's also something that to take into account. But yeah, like you said, at least in the case of Uppsalir, we do have evidence for a monumentalization of the site, of a strategy of monumentalization of the site during the Viking Age, an elite-driven effort to reshape the landscape, because the Vikings, the Norse, did erect a couple of mounds themselves, but then they also reused these mounds that were from the Iron Age, and then they also reused the halls. I think that's also important because these mounds, as you said, they were not really singular in the landscape; they were part of a much larger complex, and we do have halls here as well in Uppsalir, and very interestingly, by the end of the Viking Age, there is at least one hall, the largest one, which is not really used anymore. And there is also evidence that it was kind of like maybe buried, or it died itself, in the sense that they were doing something with this hole. They were trying to get some remains of animals or cremate animals. I'm not very sure. I think they cremated animals on the site of the holes, and then they covered it with 3 layers of clay. So there was kind of like, we can interpret it as some sort of burial for the hole itself. So there was a deliberate strategy to monumentalize this center and to anchor the memory of the rulers in the landscape. And I think that aligns with let's say broader patterns of consolidation of power and long distance interaction that we can notice across the Scandinavian landscape.
Yeah, so these mounds were famed almost with stories that were told not only at their locations, but people would know where to go because of the connections to and the stories, and they almost project out. Every trade route, every traveler would be sharing not only the story of the funeral, but centuries later the stories that the landscape is prompting. I mean, I do wonder about with these central places, and we have the Old English poem Beowulf, but perhaps there were many more where that are about those heroes, and but they're also about halls, and they're also about burial mounds, and they're also about that landscape. So there's those landscapes of power and authority, and so there's that whole mashing together of historical reality and various legendary layers of storytelling. Yeah. It's very interesting.
Exactly, yeah, and the interest did not disappear during the Christian era. So we know though that Icelanders they were obsessed with their past. They were obsessed with showing who they were, with forming a cultural identity and transmitting it in writing. So you have the Book of Settlements and the Book of the Icelanders and so on, and this is also visible in the Scandinavian landscape, in the sense that in the Christian times, mounds were not destroyed, but they were kind of like reintegrated or recontextualized. For example, here in Uppsala, we do have a cathedral that was built nearby, and it kind of integrated the mound in the landscapes, and also the some of the stones, the standing stones we find here, they were reused. So you can see in such cases that people were trying to communicate with their own past and to reframe it according to the new realities.
So what else do they, I mean, we know that there was grave robbing going on as well. People wanted to re-access these mounds. Is that something we can see in the sources, or is that only from the archaeology?
I don't think it's only from the archaeology, because we have a lot of stories, although they do pertain to the legendary sagas, which are sources written in the 13th, 14th, even later century. We do have a lot of stories about heroes going on a quest and they end up in a mound looking for something. So I think also in these stories we do have some sort of memory regarding what people used to do. With the grave robbing, I mean, we have in the case of Oseberg, it is known that Oseberg was robbed very little time after the burial took place. So yeah, for multiple reasons, people tried to interact with these mounts. Sometimes they did it just to steal stuff. Other times they would do it to assert their own authority. Sometimes they would do it to destroy, because memory is also related to forgetting. So I think we should ask ourselves also the question: what do these people attempted to preserve, and what do these people attempted to make forgotten? So this game of power between the past and the present. Yeah.
So in this case, you've got a story of
this is something I really enjoy from the saga of Harald Fairhair. The way Harald interacts with some of the other petty kings in Norway, and some of them are trying to just escape his influence. They decide to do that by constructing a mound, and it's very interesting because it is mentioned here, and this is something I've also seen in some of the legendary sagas, that the king goes inside with a whole army. So this is very interesting. I think it is also mentioned that they took all kinds of goods and food and drink and whatever to the mound, and then it is also mentioned that kings were accustomed to sit on the mounds, and this is again something we see in later legislation telling you not to do that. So do not sit on the mound. You can find it in the Christian law, in the Borgarthing law and the Frostathing law, for example. Do not sit on the mound because it will bring you accusations of witchcraft or something like that. So I think this is interesting because it shows that maybe this custom was something related to what people were actually doing at some point in the past, like sitting on the mound in the hope that you would gain some kind of knowledge, perhaps secret knowledge, or just a way to, relate or communicate with the past by orchestrating this encounter at a mound that you knew either from hearsay or from more reliable sources you knew pertained to some important person from the past.
So you have the mounds are almost active participants in the landscapes of the Viking Age and later, and people want to. I mean,
they want to interact with them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose with the qualifier that a large period of time they don't want to interact with them. They are they are respected or feared or venerated in different ways by different people with different relationships with those mounds and the stories around them. So, but there are moments where active intervention, active dialogue with the occupants was a possibility, maybe in emergencies, crises, or is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I can think of a very interesting and legendary saga now. It's a late saga, but I think it can tell us a little bit about what people might have thought about these monuments. There is a story called the story of Thorstein Mansionmite, and there is this guy Thorstein who, at some point, he sees a large mound, and then he sees a child go towards this mound, and he follows the child, and he sees that it was actually the mound of his mother, of the mother of the child, and the child talks to his mother, who is apparently living in the mound somehow, and he requests a Gandrleid, which is some sort of staff used to travel, and he gets a staff from this mound, and the child uses the staff to go inside the mound. So Thorstein does the same thing. He summons the mother of this boy, and he himself gets one of the staffs, and they both go together in this mound. And the story goes that Thorstein sees a large banquet taking place in the mound with people feasting and generally being joyful. And I think at some point he also comments on the fact that this is not how he thought of the underworld or something like that. And then again, this story goes on that he tries to steal something from there, and he is followed by a bunch of people, and they have to get out using this task. It's a legendary saga, but it kind of enriches perhaps our perspective about how people might have felt or thought about these mounts. There's also another story telling something about a poet who used to spend all his nights on the mound of another poet in the hope that he would become as good as this one. And then eventually the dead lad comes from the mound and tells him, okay, you can be as good as I am if you remember these verses. So if you remember these verses, you're going to be as good as I am, but please leave me alone. Don't come here ever again.
Maybe it's just trying to get rid of him so he doesn't have to hear the crap.
Yeah, that was the case. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because no matter how sort of how there may be many of these stories that are lost, and you can say these are not representative, but still they do show that. I like the idea of staffs and what that might mean, because obviously we have CRS's staffs on discussions about those, and we have staffs for pilgrimage by the Christian era, so we have a symbolic associate. I mean, there's lots of ways in which traveling is linked to staff holding.
Traveling to the underworld as well.
That is very interesting, and the idea that the mounds may actually be what should we say, expandable spaces like TARDISes, if you know your Doctor Who, that you go into them and there's many other dimensions and they're much bigger, that the relatively small space can contain a whole manner of an imaginative world, either beneath the mound or in that space. They are hills they are natural, they are human-made hills, and of course that overlaps with some of the Icelandic sagas that do talk about mountains and hills as places for the dead as well. So there's that blurring of that. I do correct me. The stuff better than me, but
I think we're safe to consider them some sort of liminal space, at least according to literary sources. It's a space where it's kind of like between life and death. There is an interesting poem called the Lay of Helgi, Helga Kvíða Hundingsbani, I think it was in 2, where we have a reference to the hero Helgi, who is the brother of Sigurd. He is less known, unfortunately, less known than Sigurd. But it's a very interesting poem because it shows Helgi actually living in the mound. But at the same time, he is riding in Valhall with his following. And there doesn't seem to be a contradiction between these two places and activities he undertakes, and he ends up actually coming back from the world of the dead because his wife, the Valkyria Svova, is really in grief because of his death, and he ends up coming back at some point, and he actually spends a night with her. This is one one of those poems that both creep you out and you think, oh, that's very interesting. So, spending a night with the undead.
Yeah.
At any rate, yeah, it's very interesting that you don't really find this contradiction between the two ways of being or of being dead. Because afterwards he just says, yeah, I'm still going to be dwelling here, but at the same time, yeah, I'm being called back to Valhall, so I have to go back. But it's definitely, I think it's definitely safe to assume that they would have been considered some sort of liminal space. I mean, if you look at even later sources, such as the quests of the heroes going to do battle with the drows, with the mound dwellers, it's also they do have the pattern of a quest of the quest of the hero in order to assert themselves and to gain honor and prestige and so on. But I do get the impression when I read these episodes that there is a little bit more to it, that these stories are trying to show us that life and death are very much united in this sort of landscape, and that people are really trying to interact with the past and with the afterlife using them.
So, if we, what we got here? So,
if you wanted to ask a question, be my guest or comment.
No. I'm happy. I'll be quiet for a moment.
Yeah, I think it was my last example from the King's Sagas. It's in the saga of Håkon the Good, one of the Christian kings of Norway, and here we can find a lot of interesting things. He had a very tense relationship with the farmers in Norway, particularly in northern Norway, who are not really that happy about the conversion. And we have here reference to the so-called Mini, which would have been the memorial toast, and it is said that this memorial toast would have taken place for the people who are buried in Mounds. So I think that might also be relevant for this discussion, in order to highlight this idea that the Mounds were used or reused or reshaped in later sources in order to create this link to the deep past. And the mound burial, the age of the mound burials is mentioned again. There is this very angry farmer in chapter 15 who comes to King Håkon, and he starts complaining about all these changes taking place, about the fact that now they're supposed to be Christians, and what are they supposed to do? Forget everything that was before, forget the age of cremation, and forget the age of these mounts. What are they supposed to do? Yeah, and eventually King Håkon accepts some of their requests. He does take part in some of the feasts they organize, but then there are also recurrent tensions stemming from the fact that he refuses to eat horse meat, for example. So it's a very tense situation, and highlighting this whole mix-up of belief systems and clashes between belief systems. There is an episode detailing his death. The fact that he died in battle, and he doesn't really manage to get the burial he wanted, the Christian burial. He does say at the end that I'm still going to go to the place I know best, so to the Christian paradise. I'm going to be among my people, but you can do with my body whatever you decide. So if you decide to bury me in a heathen way, then do it. And this is actually what happens. They bury him in a burial mound, but it's also very interesting that they bury him without any other goods besides his weapons and his clothes. So this is kind of at the limit, at the border between Christianity and paganism, as we read the text. However, the text does end with this idea that he was directed to Valhall. Whether he ended up in Valhall or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, he wanted to go to the Christian paradise, so I don't think he was very happy with it. But there is also a poem about this. It's called the Håkonarmál. It was actually the inspiration for the saga. So this would be my last example of what happens with these mounts. As you can see, they're very much related to the ideas regarding high status, regarding rulership, power, dominance, but also this whole idea of integrating them into this larger memorial culture that is being turned into literature in later centuries.
Maybe it's something for another discussion to look at the Icelandic sagas in a similar regard, where obviously a different society, a different, perhaps less emphasis on royal power, but where mounds do still feature. But you know, it so perhaps we'll leave that for a future discussion. But there's, because I was going to quiz you about some of that, but that perhaps is not for today. But in terms of thinking about these mounds, though, I mean, one of the things that I find as an archaeologist is the increasing emphasis, and this is something I've written about and some other scholars have picked up on, but it's not really been fully developed, to at least my reading, is the role of communal participation in the construction of these mounds. And for me, you know, if we go back to sort of Ahmad ibn Fadlan's Risala, where he's talking about this elaborate funeral on the Volga River bank with cremation of a ship, and just I think we mentioned before, you know, how cursory his mention of the mound building is, you know, and almost whether he was actually still even present when that happened or not. But that, if I was there and you were there, or our audience was there, I'm sure an important part of that Viking chieftain's funeral, or Rus chieftain's funeral, to be more precise, would have been not simply the burning of a ship with sacrificed animals and slave girl, which is the fixation of Ibn Fadlan, but also this mound building, which would have involved not only labor, but presumably people are still drinking and eating, and they need to get people to do that labor, you have to entertain them, you have to sustain them. So there's social obligations, but there's also that the construction of these mounds would have been, you know, collective enterprises.
Exactly.
And, you know, there's so many myths about Egyptian pyramids being built by slaves and all this stuff. But, you know, yes, I'm not saying they didn't get the thralls to do some of the work or the mainstay of the heavy work, but it still involves, if you've got enslaved people there, you also need people to orchestrate it, to manage it, to feed those people. So whichever way you think about these mound construction, whether it's coercion or, you know, a sense of social bonds and obligation, or a mixture, these mounds are the product of days of labor to make something that is going to be not simply the moving of earth and stone, but also presumably, as in Ibn Fadlan, a some kind of post elaborately carved, or just with runes carved on it, and that takes time too. And maybe not, you may not think that's a big task, but we don't know how sizable that was. But if we think about something comparable to a rune stone, then you are still looking at, you've got to move that, you've got to carry that, you've got to place that. All of this is labor, and that is part of the memory work for me. Is it's the fact people were there in various states of drunkenness, in various states of you know,
creation of collective identity of some sort.
Yeah, and this would have therefore been a memorable event that would then be spoken about, sung about, and physically remembered as something that would mark almost a generation. You wouldn't be doing this every day. Oh, another person's died, let's put up a massive mound. Yes, there would have been smaller markers, but these are exceptional funerals for exceptional individuals that were, I expect, were intended to be remembered by those participating, and that is the basis of the memory culture, is the participation in the practices, and the giving of objects, the giving of animals to be feasted upon, or to be joining in the sacrifices, the horses, the dogs, the chickens, the sheep, whatever it may be. So I think people thinking about these as just finished products is perhaps, you know, misses a lot of what we find in the archaeological record.
Yeah, and that's why I was mentioning at the beginning that I really find these literary sources interesting from this perspective, that they can enrich our vision about how to interpret them, because they're not, like you said, they're not really stamps in the landscape. They are really much more dynamic, active, and they involve communities, they involve people, and they definitely contributed to the shaping of an identity. Yeah.
And they didn't stand alone, did they? They were augmented. These locations,
were integrated in broader landscapes. Yeah, there is an interesting theory I found by Tim Ingold. He talks about the dwelling perspective, and the dwelling perspective means exactly this: the idea that people don't get shaped by landscapes, but that they get shaped with landscapes together.
And this links to that. I mean, in terms of the dwelling perspective, is the repetitive routes of movement, the actual, as we said, the tasks of daily life into which these mound buildings and funerals were part of. That trying to understand these is not, now we're into the ritual time, let's do the crazy stuff. This is part of this is part of how you live in that landscape. You may be going, you may be going to this place rarely, but it's memorable, or you're living within the shadow of these mounds. So it's not that these mounds can be seen for hundreds of miles, but it's about their relationship with that worked landscape, the woodland, the fens, the grazing lands, the fields, the arable land, the different settlements in which these, and the river courses are very important, I think, as well. The people traveling past these mounds and thinking of places like Valsierda, which is a really interesting site, near Uppsala, a series of boat graves and burial mounds, multiple phases from the Roman Iron Age onwards, right the way up to the Viking Age. This is such a prominent ridge next to the river. It's not going to be seen for hundreds of miles, but you have to engage with it if you're going to go down the Fyris River, the principal watercourse of that whole region. So you're kind of, these mounds are part of that worked landscape, that landscape of mobility. And so I think Ingold's idea is really important there.
Yeah, you can see it in later medieval sources mentioning thing assemblies, for example, taking place at some of the mounds, have some of the sites that also contain mounds. Okay, in the meantime, also other buildings appeared on these sites, but generally speaking, the whole complex would have been important in terms of social gatherings as well, even after Christianization. And there was definitely a revival going on in the 19th century in Scandinavia, where we do have quite a lot of reports about not only archaeological excavations or attempts at archaeological excavations being done at these mounds, but also about people gathering at the mounds to celebrate something, to celebrate a national day or a regional day or whatever. So there are legends, for example, about the mound of King Ragnar, which is a mound in Norway, a very interesting one. I think it's the largest one. And there are legends from I think beginning with the 17th century about this black man roaming around the place besides his mound. And apparently he got really, really upset when the people who bought the land there decided to build this sort of a small temple of some kind on the mound for their child who died at a very young age. So again, even in later times, we can see this interaction with the deep past very much vivid.
So that's where I was going to go. I mean, just for viewers who may get, people willfully find misunderstanding when you say black, it's more like the idea of a corpse of a So that leads into the very literal Ingold dwelling approach, which is that these mounds are places that are thought in the literature to be places where the dead reside. You don't simply
they're very material.
So we have that sort of sense that you enter into the mounds, you can fight with the dead, you can gain wisdom of the dead. There's a sort of whole, that doesn't mean that works for every burial site, but there's that sense that burial sites are active, they have an animacy, there's something there. They're not like up and jumping around all the time, and they can't get out and just walk the landscape all the time. If something goes wrong, it kind of breaks down those barriers. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. There are many ways to interact with the mounds in the sagas. There can be an interaction like what you see in the saga of Njol, where you have Gunnar, one of the heroes, who just sits besides his saga and he starts singing. Okay, he eggs on his people to avenge his death, but at any rate, he's not violent. He's not violent like physically. She's just there in the landscape, like kind of like mingling with the landscape. But then you have these episodes, like I said, in the legendary sagas, where just you have like these heroes who they just go straight on. They got straight ahead into these mounds, and we have very detailed descriptions in sagas such as the saga of Bardar from Snæfellsnes, where you have these people organizing this great quest in order to go to this mound and to retrieve a treasure of some sort. But they're not always, I mean, sometimes they can be passive, sometimes they can be active. In the sagas of the Icelanders, many of them are very much aggressive and very disruptive for the environment. But I think by the time the legendary sagas are written, they become a little more a little more tamed, so to speak. So you can deal with them. You also have characters who actually help heroes in their quests.
So may we talk about one aspect which I've been writing about, and that is about how our popular TV shows have picked up this theme or haven't, because I was very frustrated by the early series. The Last Kingdom,
that's what I was going
up.
to ask. Did they pick up on this theme?
Well, they do in the end, but very partially, because with the death of Björn Ironside, they put him in this strange Byzantine mausoleum. And on a horse, stuck somehow, a corpse on a horse with his hand. So they're trying to create this romanticized, almost legendary, unbelievable honoring of Björn in death. But in a lot of the early episodes, they grasped onto this idea that Vikings burn the dead on ships and bury the dead in ships. So they got that idea from archaeology, and they ran with that. But they never thought, and then in I think it's season 3, when Floki gets married, he retrieves a sword from an old burial site of his father. And so there's a sense of, there's this idea of, to marry, he had to exchange a sword. So he went to his father's graves to get the sword, which was miraculously not rusty at all. It was kind of, they were trying to play with the idea of interaction with the dead. And there was a few graveside scenes, but it was only with the TV, only with the season 6 finale and Björn death. They have this idea that on the skyline above Kattegat, they build this burial mound that very much looks like a mixture of a sort of Theodoric's. I was thinking of Theodoric's mausoleum or something like that, with a Neolithic passage grave. So they're trying to blend these ideas in this legendary fictional world. So they go some way, but they never ever think. I know they've got filming restrictions. They can't just bulldoze massive mounds, but they never go and show burial mounds. Proper humphing great. They could have CGI'd it, but they never do it. And I was frustrated by that, because surely from a saga point of view, if that TV show and its spin-offs are trying to show us a legendary Viking age, it's not really history. It's trying to show you a legendary drama rather than a historical drama. If that's a generous way of trying to understand it, that's my attempt. Then you'd at least want to see these big burial mounds with people sleeping, communing with the dead and draugrs. And it's only, as here we go, only in the film Northman do we have a recent rendition of that. So over to you on this.
I was very happy to see the scene. I was very happy to see the scene because Robert Eggers really tried to recreate some of the episodes, like a mashup of the episodes we find in the Icelandic sagas. I think he got really inspired by, if I'm not mistaken, by Grettir Saga, because Grettir Saga was the saga he got inspired with relation to what happens to the head of the Revenant, which I found it was really nice touch, because the head of the Revenant was placed between the buttocks. So I think that was taken from Grettir Saga. And the fact that we see this guy sitting in the chair is again something taken from some of the sagas. I think in the saga of Hromund, the Revenant Thrain is found on the throne, if I'm not mistaken, and in Harda Saga, at any rate, we do have examples stating very clearly that these people, that these people were sitting in the grave, and also the battle. So I think he tried to recreate it quite beautifully in the scene, but I think it's kind of unique. I don't have any knowledge of any other Viking movies attempting to do so, to show such a thing. Okay, I can think about Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings also has something like that, right? I mean, in the Return of the King, when Aragorn goes to a passage in the mountain and he's trying to convince the army of the dead to go with him, I think he's also I think Tolkien and then Peter Jackson also resorted to some of these motifs in a way.
I think that's fair, and there would have been more of that if they'd kept the Barrow Wights from the Fellowship of the Ring in the film version. But likewise, but the Rings of Power has returned to that in its season 2 with the attempt to show the Barrow Wights fighting the elves in the Second Age. Doesn't quite work, but it does play with this idea of the waking or the undead physically, having a physical presence. And I suppose if I was going to be a little bit more critical than you were of Eggers, what really annoyed me about that scene was it was just made into a dream sequence rather than,
Oh,
it was a
right.
physical,
Yeah.
it was a physical battle. But then it was like a kind of, at least in my memory, I haven't seen that.
Yeah,
I
I
got so
forgot
angry
about
about it
that. I
because
think you're right. I think you're
I,
right.
I
Yeah, it was a
I
dream sequence. Yeah.
loved that I thought, oh yes, here we go,
Yeah.
and it was made like,
Hmm.
oh, that was all a dream, and I was going, oh right, I thought we were entering into a world where spiritual and the our plane merged and blurred, and if anything, I thought the TV show Vikings did better at that, where there was interaction with the spiritual, not with Graves so much, but in the case of season 6, they do go into the mound of Björn, and they interact with his corpse. He's not alive, but there is a sense of interactivity. Whereas this, I thought it was just a fight, and then that was that. And I kind of wish there had been more. I thought they didn't go far enough. I wanted to see more sort of sense that is a real place. And was it real? Why don't we just leave that ambiguous? Because that's what the sagas do. Surely they leave it. Yeah, these guys did these things. They did go and interact and dig up these people and cut off their head, and Glamour's head gets put between his buttocks as a insult, I presume, as a so I like that. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's it. They're all playing on these ideas.
yeah, it's one of the things I enjoy most about both the Mound Dwellers and the Aptelganger, the Revenants, are the ones who actually come back, is their materiality. I think that's very unique in general in the medieval literature dealing with the dead. The fact that they're very much corporeal, you interact with them in a very direct way, and this makes them very interesting topic to study from the perspective of memory, because they do embody this whole idea of the problematic past, or a past that needs to be tackled, or a past that needs to be overcome, or generally speaking, interact with the past. It's kind of like a continuity between past and present, and at the same time a tension. I think it's very well embodied in these characters.
And so I think this is a really rich area of conversation from the evidence we have from the sagas and the archaeology. It's not that they match up and necessarily give us two halves of one complete whole picture, but they're two avenues in which we can have roots onto a complex and shifting memory culture, in which Graves and Mounds in particular have a really powerful resonance in real landscapes, as well as imaginary sort of or more legendary spaces. I really, I think there's a lot more that scholars could do with this in terms of thinking through these connections, and the mound as a place where the dead are buried in, but also where you interact with, you've met, perhaps foresee the past, the future. There's all sorts of spiritual connections there. And I think it's also something that I think heritage sites should use more about. Yes, we are dealing with landscapes, particularly in parts of Scandinavia, which were not subject to the same intensified, that's it, intensified industrial and agricultural revolutions that say the British landscape have. Well, we do have entire cemeteries. I was recently in Uppland, where visiting a heritage site, and that they've got the reconstructed Viking farm, but right next to it you've got two Iron Age set burial grounds, and then they don't make much out of them. And I had to explain to my Swedish friend, who's not an archaeologist, I said, oh look, here's the cemetery, and they went, what, that's just some bumps. And I said, no, look, you've got about 7 burial mounds here, and there's some stone settings, and these are still physical traces of the Scandinavian landscape. And therefore, I think there's more that we could do as disciplines to talk about this, because it's a way that people today can access the past. I'm not saying people should try and dig into these graves and fight Draugr or whatever the other terms are for these mound dwellers, but I do think these are part of our cultural heritage that we that we can sort of discuss from both perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense of landscape being not much more than just a backdrop. It's actively shaped both by the people in the past and by us today, mirroring different identities, stories, and Yeah, the way we try to create like this mutual contact and possession between us and our ancestors.
But perhaps what I mean, one final point. I don't know if it has to be a final point, but one thing I want to perhaps add on is that we have to also acknowledge that many of the named mounds are antiquarian
Oh
kind of
yes, yep,
inventions. So when you
yeah,
have
most of
Anund's
them really.
yeah. So while we're talking about a medieval tradition that remembers these mounds, we don't have a continuity. Like some people who are perhaps spiritually inclined like to talk about an unbroken tradition. But it has to be on. We have to be honest that most of the named mounds in Scandinavia are antiquarians going, oh, that could be the mound of Halfdan the whatever. And there's about 2 or 3 mounds of Björn Ironside, and these are modern to antiquarians going around the landscapes of Scandinavia going, oh, let's link these to the sagas. So we have to remember that is the romantic nationalist and modern era has created a new layers of fictive memory work which are perhaps not necessarily cumulative on but are sort of reinventing those connections.
Yeah, in Uppsala, for example, I think it was the Östhaugr, which was called for a very long time the Mound of Odin. Yeah, for
Yeah.
example, or yeah, the Raknehaugen in Norway. I think again it was something from perhaps the 17th or 18th century. People thought about, hey, this is a big mound. Ragnar or Rognvald, they were big kings. Let's name the mound after them.
And there's a really interesting discussion by Tyr Ostergaard and Anders Kallif about the Hårga Mound near Uppsala, which is a Bronze Age mound and cult building. We do seem to have a medieval tradition of association with saga characters. So there's not a continuity from the Bronze Age, but this mound has clearly had story upon story written onto it and through time. And I think that's the thing about mounds is you can't fix their stories. They're always going to be shifting and changing. And that's one of the frustrating things, but I think the fun things about any kind of oral history that has textual elements and then the material dimensions. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in some upcoming discussions, maybe we can talk a bit about the family sagas as well, how they
I would love to.
represent. Yeah.
I have a little
Yeah.
bit more confidence with those. At least I've read them. I haven't done any real analysis, but at least I've got a sense of some of them. And some of them are just really fascinatingly boring. They're just.
Yeah, they don't really have regarding the mounts. I don't think they have these episodes with like you have in the legendary sagas, like these very fascinating episodes with people actively seeking the dead and going to disturb them in the mounds. There are some representations about people, I don't know, where they buried their dead or with what, or I think it was Egil who was buried near a church, in a mound near a church. I don't. I have to reread it myself. But at any rate, we have these like short snippets of what they were doing with the dead.
But the fact they actually recorded it at all, I think, is worth discussion because and we'll do this next time. Maybe is that all right to do that next time? Because I think
absolutely
because again, this is very much we're not really planning this, guys. We're kind of sort of just riffing off ideas, but we there's some planning, but equally though, I just wanted to see where this goes, and if you're happy with that, amenable with that, and this links to your expertise, I would love to just talk about the family sagas because I think it's not that they're elaborate, just stories of spiritual stuff. It's just really boring descriptions. But the fact that they were remembering what happened to not everyone, but some of these characters is just so intriguing.
Yeah, exactly. And also the difference perhaps between mounds and some other things they mentioned. Cairns, Dees, for example, is a term they often mention, and apparently the revenants who were the most aggressive, they were not buried in mounds. They were buried in these Dees, in these cairns, so they are smaller tombs. So I think there might be a connection there as well.
That is something I confess I didn't understand or know because I'm reading them in basic translation. I didn't know that. No, I didn't know that. So that is something I'm learning as I go.
Yeah, the very aggressive ones. Yeah, for example, Thorolf from the Erbygja saga, he was buried in such a tomb. I mean, it's definitely he definitely has a problem with claims on territory because he dies because of a discussion with his son about him not wanting to help him get back some woodland. He dies in anger, and he's not buried in like a high status monument. And apparently he had a problem with that because when the slave dies because of him, he is buried with him. So to me, it's a sign that maybe in a death, they were kind of like trying to make it up to him by creating a more elevated room for him in the afterlife. Didn't really help, but at least there was an attempt there to satisfy him in death.
Well, let's look at that. But it's all about, it may be in the text, but it's all about the materiality. So it's like archaeology in the text, archaeology of the text. It all links together, and that's the fun thing.
Yep, totally.
So that's on, right. That's our agreed topic for next time. But thanks everybody for tuning in, and we shall continue our explorations of death in the Old Norse sources as we go to Iceland next time. Thank you, Irina.
Absolutely. My pleasure. See you next time.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.